because people often dismiss these small gardens as being a nice thing to do, but it won't really feed you. And it seriously can feed you, as it turns out. So in 2018, we know that we harvested 428 kilos of herbs, veg, fruit, and eggs from this small space. And I'm going to share some examples with you today, or one example in particular, where they're also collecting data from a tiny space of only 4 square metres. And I'll leave that as a bit of a cliffhanger for how much they managed to grow in a much, much smaller space. But I just wanted to share with you, this is my context and my background, and I will refer to some of examples from my place, but I'm also going to focus a lot more on the really tiny spaces that are out there. So the first topic, of course, is design. I'm a permaculturalist, so we like to look at things from patterns and then get down to the details. So we are going to start with these big picture patterns and then work our way down to some of the nitty gritty. I know a couple of you have just said in the chat that you're interested in pest control, and that's one of the omissions for this session. So if you are tuning in for pest control, I'm sorry about that, but we do have lots of other detailed sessions in the My Smart Garden program where you can get a great perspective on that. And the session is being recorded as well for people who have asked, so you would be able to check back later. So with design, the first thing I want to say is that no space is too small. And I've got an example on the left here of my friend Annie's place, and she lives in a rented unit over in Brunswick. And I hope you can see maybe by the scale of the window in there that this is not a large garden bed here. What we're really looking at is a strip of land that is about maybe a foot or 30 centimetres wide. And most of these small units will have some kind of landscaping in a similar kind of scale. What Annie's managed to do is transform that into the most lush, beautiful jungle of parsley and silver beet, and in this case, basil. And I can't think she would need more silver beet or parsley than what she's growing there. So she's making a great contribution to some ingredients that are often wasted and often heavily packaged and refrigerated and so on. So it's a great contribution even from a small area. What was interesting to me when I looked at the photo again this week was just remembering the orientation of her place. I think that basil is actually south facing this strip. So in other words, this is not a super sunny spot that I would expect basil to go well. But there's a reason, I think, why the basil is looking quite lush and happy, and I'm going to come back to that in just a second. On the right hand side is a little patch from my place, and this is seriously this is just on the edge of a path walkway in a little ditch, which is like an open drain. And if you can find a space, there will be a plant and a food plant that matches it. And in this little drain here, I've got lemon balm, which is the one at the bottom of the screen here, if you can see my mouse. I've actually got mint, which is a bit surprising, and that's an experiment. I'm going to see how that goes in summer because it usually prefers quite shaded and or it doesn't like these really hot, blazing sunny spots, which this is. And in the actual bed itself, you can see I've got an array of salad things. I've got some different types of sorrel in here, a blood sorrel and a normal French sorrel. I've got some garlic chives here. I've got some mustard, and I've got some little violas here as well. And so both of these strips, the salad on the left here and the mint in the drain, that would not be more than 20 centimetres wide in each case. So what I'm really trying to get home here is if you've got a tiny crack in the pavement, you can probably do something with it. But it is really important to have realistic expectations about what you can do in a small space and what you can't do. So I'm not saying you're going to be self-sufficient in vegetables. What I'm saying is you've got a really good chance of being able to grow a lot of your own herbs and particularly leafy greens. These are some of the most nutritious things you can grow. Some of the ingredients that are most wasted, we know, and also some of the ingredients that require careful packaging, cooling, and transportation. So from a sustainability perspective, it's an awesome thing to be doing at home. Okay, I can see some questions. I think some of them are going to be answered, so I'm going to skip through if that's okay, because I will come to some of these things. and lots of great tips being added already by people, so it's lovely to see. While we're just looking at other examples as an introduction, I thought I'd show you what a fruit tree can look like in a small space, acknowledging that you won't have ground to grow these in, and we'll look in apartments and balconies, but I'll look at some other options for those later on. So I thought I'd show you a picture of my persimmon tree, which is part of a very narrow strip of ground that runs along a fence line in my garden. This strip of ground is about 400 mil or 40 centimetres wide. This persimmon tree that you're looking at probably is about 2 metres wide, I'd say, and getting on for about 2 metres high at the moment. And to give you an example of the value of a tree of this size, this persimmon is easily producing more than 15 kilos of fruit for us every year. It's getting more every year, in fact. So we don't need more persimmons than that. So I try and keep the trees quite small so I can have more variety in the garden. And on this side here, there's a goji berry, which I'm training as like a long column up a bit of a bracing wire, because we've got a dodgy fence. And on the other side, we've got a mandarin tree, which is also being shaped to be quite flat. This mandarin tree is multi-grafted. That means we've got actually 2 different types of mandarin that are grafted onto the same trunk, and we'll have imperial mandarins for a couple of months in early winter. And then once we've eaten those, we flick over to emperor mandarins and have those for another few months. So by multi-grafting, we can actually have in that one tree a spread of harvest that can last for twice as long as you might have if you just had one tree. So that's the difference between being able to actually use all the crop or having to think about how am I going to preserve it. And of course, we like to share produce as well. But to supply our own kitchen, it's really helpful to have that nice spread of harvest. And just before we move on here, I want to note a couple of other things about this for people who are going, oh, I've got a strip of fence along my driveway somewhere, or some space where I could fit this in. It's not hard to do, but the key with getting the trees to be this shape is as they're growing, you need to shape them quite actively. So what I've been doing here is actually tying these branches back so that they set in the position that I want. And if we do have any parts of the tree that poke straight forward into the path, I'm cutting them off. So there's nothing really complicated about that. But what you don't want to do is just plant the tree and then allow it to grow whichever way it wants, because it will inevitably want to lurch forward and take up all that sunny space. So just gently, actively, slowly training these trees so that by the time they're established, they're a nice kind of 2-dimensional tree that goes along the fence line. This is also quite a light edge because we can get sun coming in from the side here. So if you've got a side that gets floodlit with sun, then you can get away with having some understory plants, and that can also increase your yield. So here I've got comfrey, which is probably not so much an edible plant, but certainly a really complementary plant around fruit trees for cycling nutrients, for encouraging bees and other predatory insects, many, many other roles if you'd like to look up comfrey. And we can get away with that also because these trees drop their leaves through the winter. That becomes a really sunny area that helps those plants. And we've also got lots of alpine strawberries, which are not so easy to see in the photograph. And we have some violets as well in here. So just thinking about whether you're going to get sun down at the ground level or not, you can think about whether some extra layers are possible in your situation. So anyway, there's just a couple of little intro photos. I have one more as well. If you don't have any soil, you can build up on top of paving and on top of concrete. And I wanted to show you this one, which is a very low budget garden in a rental property of a friend's place in Carlton. And so they've just used scrap timber that they've found in skips, and they've built up some raised garden beds on top of their concrete ground. So I'm really helping to ease just the baking hot microclimate. If you can imagine sun hitting all this concrete in summer, this lush green garden helps ameliorate that. quite a bit. So I wanted to point this out in this design. If you are building garden beds, a nice design thing to think about here is, can I reach every part of this garden? So in this case, Michael can walk around to all sides of these beds. So that means about 2 arms reach is a nice width, which for most people is about 1.2 to 1.5 metres across. If you're designing in a really small space and you can only put beds along a fence line, for example, then you'd actually probably put them only 1 arm's width wide. So in other words, half the width of these beds, to make sure that you can really access and harvest and manage that space effectively. I've just found that if we can't reach and manage it, we tend not to notice when things are ready, we tend not to harvest, then we tend not to pick off caterpillars because they're too hard for us to access. But lots of things happen more easily if it's easy for your arm to reach the part of the bed. Michael even has some water storage, even in this small space, which you can see down the bottom here in the right-hand corner. These are a series of old olive drums, which are becoming more valuable actually, but at the time you could get them for free in many places. And these are hooked up to a downpipe diverter, and they'll fill up as an array. And even a small water tank, you'd be actually quite surprised by how much it fills up, because you use it as it fills, and so it does actually catch many thousands of litres of water over the year. I can see questions on best plants for south-facing balconies. It's all coming, I promise. I'll just check in with Beck if there's anything on what I've just discussed that we should answer before I move on.
There are a couple questions about your mandarin tree. Did you buy it that way or graft it? And can you have a multi-grafted mandarin in a barrel or pot or container?
Yes, you can absolutely do that in containers as well. And I will be giving you lists of plants that I think are really appropriate for small spacing containers, shaded spaces, hot spaces, and so on. I bought that mandarin multi-grafted, but I have recently put on a tangelo, and I've also put on an orange as well. So grafting is not very difficult to do. There will be hundreds of YouTube videos showing you how to do it. For people who want to look up an easy technique, the method that I've used is called cleft grafting, C-L-E-F-T. And it's basically taking a twig from another citrus tree that you want, slicing a little V shape on the bottom of it, and then cutting off the branch you want to graft it to, slicing that in half and inserting that V, and then taping it up. There's a few little tricks in there, but it's actually not very hard. And I guess the secret for home gardeners is to just do quite a few of them, and your odds improve, obviously, if you've got more chances. So cleft grafting is a great technique to try onto citrus trees. And for anyone who wants to know more about citrus and grafting methods, our local legend is a man called Ian Tolley, and his whole career has been in the citrus industry, and he's really pioneered lots of new techniques for grafting citrus. He has a fantastic book called Common Sense Citrus that explains with lots and lots of photographs all of these different methods, and I highly recommend it. Was there something else in there, Beck?
There was a really great question which ties into what you were talking about initially. What kind of produce would have the biggest effect on reducing carbon emissions if we could all grow it ourselves? Do you have a quick answer for that one?
Oh, look, it's pretty complicated. Yeah, there's lots of variables in there. Where it's grown is important, but also how it was grown. Was it grown in heated greenhouses that use brown coal-fueled electricity? Actually, if anyone's seen the Fight for Planet A series on the ABC, the produce that came out most carbon intensive was not even red meat, which is well known to be quite intensive and probably not something you're going to be farming at home, but actually frozen asparagus, I think, or tinned asparagus, I'm sorry. No, it was frozen from somewhere like Mexico, because it had to be kept frozen all the way from another country on the other side of the world. So really, if you're replacing things that might be imported, particularly in an energy intensive form like frozen, possibly they'd come up best in these sorts of trials. But I really do emphasise herbs and leafy greens because they are known to be some of the most impactful.
Yeah, awesome. I reckon we can move on, Kat. I think you'll cover a lot of the other queries at this stage.
Lovely. And if anyone out there does know the answer to some of these questions, so sourcing things, feel free to pop them in the chat window as well.
Please.
Okay, so I'm going to show you another example now, and this is really drilling down into a tiny space. I know some of you will have seen this on Gardening Australia, but I'm going to replay it because I think this is just one of the best examples that we have at the moment on small space gardening.
The great Australian dream. Buy a nice little house, maybe do it up a bit, work on the garden. But the reality is, heaps of people actually rent for life. So what does that mean for the gardening prospects of the 30% of Australians who are on a lease? No garden, or pour all your love into the garden and then leave it behind when the lease ends. It's not like you can pick the garden up and take it with you. Or can you? We're about to meet a couple whose productive patch is totally portable.
From a small regional area near Holland.
Rabia and Steve are renting a unit in Altona in Melbourne's west. Rabia is expecting a baby in a month or so, and Steve has a broken shoulder. But despite all that, they've still got the energy to show me around. Well, I don't really need to ask where your place begins because I can sense that the food growing is happening right here.
Yep. Yes, it's a strong indicator.
Got to use all the space that we've got, basically.
If this is what you've got in the driveway, I want to see what's in the courtyard. Is this the right way?
Yep, that's the way.
Oh, so this is it. You've packed it full. I mean, there's not a lot of paver space. What sort of stuff are you growing?
We do love our teas. We have a lot of lemon balm and mint. We're trying a native mint as well. Beetroot in the corner there. And this year we're trying out eggplants, seeing how it goes here. Tomatoes are always beautiful to have. And some shallots growing here too.
This garden grows all of our salad greens, it grows all of our herbs, and we grow some of our vegetables from it as well. So around roughly about 50 kilos of produce.
And how big a footprint is the growing area?
If we were to take all these boxes and put them together, it'd be about 4 square metres.
4 square metres?
Yep, 4 square metres, that's all.
You think about your average household, they've got a lot more than 4 square metres.
Oh, absolutely.
So it's a great example of productivity in a small space.
Yep, absolutely.
So you're growing a lot of it in containers.
Since we're renting, that's basically what we have to do because you can't really dig. But at the same time, it gives us a lot of flexibility.
You can take them with you when you move. So when you build up really good soil, you don't have to put in all that compost and all that effort and then you have to leave it behind, which is wonderful.
Now, my compost alarm is going off at the moment and the sensors are telling me that there's something going on over here in the corner.
Your compost alarm is correct. We have our composting system over here. It's completely portable. Costa, would you like to get in there and grab a bucket?
You got a second arm there. I still think you could have done it yourself.
So basically, with the buckets, we have some holes drilled up the top just to let air in, and we have some holes drilled at the bottom just for drainage. So as you can see here, that's some of our finished compost. Basically, the great thing is if you need to move house, you can easily take the whole system with you.
How much compost is your little system producing?
About half a tonne a year. And the great thing is that this system produces it in small amounts. So we obviously can't use half a tonne in one go here, so we can just use it as we need
it. A portable garden like this relies on a bit of upcycling and DIY. So it's time to head to the garage to see how it's done. So is this your secret workshop?
Yes.
Where all the
magic happens. So we're going to make a wicking bucket out of a 10-litre food grade bucket. Basically, a wicking bucket means that we don't have to water as often. So, Costa, I'm going to need you to do some drilling for us.
Yeah, no worries.
So basically here, we've got agricultural poly pipe. We pre-made this where we use a little barbed irrigation joint. You can dip the ends of the poly pipe in boiling water, which just makes the pipe more malleable, a bit easier to hit over this barbed joint. So 3 holes, 1 inch apart. This will sit inside the bucket just here, almost 2/3 of the way across the bucket, just to help spread the water out a bit more evenly.
All right, so the next step is to make a drainage hole. This will then go in here, but we need to make a hole for that first.
It's 25 mil, which is just a little bit smaller than the poly pipe we're going to use.
And that makes a nice snug fit.
Yeah, exactly.
Yes. Yeah, that looks really good.
Yeah?
Thanks.
No worries.
We need to make little slits here. It feeds it through nicely. So now we can put it through here.
Yes.
Here we go.
The next step now is that we put the filler pipe in. The aim is to have the filler pipe about 90 degrees from where the front pipe is. It just makes it easier when you're filling them up. And here we've got some scoria, so it's just there to stop the soil from working its way into the water reservoir. But it's volcanic rock, it's nice and hollow. So even with the scoria inside, this can hold 2 litres of water. So we're going to put that in.
Mm-hmm.
We need to have enough scoria so it's just at the top of the drain pipe.
So covering to the high side.
That's right.
Next step is we put a weed mat in it so the soil doesn't get mixed up with the scoria. I suppose when you find your plant outgrows this side of bucket, you can ideally, lift the soil out in one go and then move it into a new one. Yeah.
Great idea.
The next step would be to put the soil in together with the compost.
So how many times have you moved this portable setup?
Well, we moved it, like the whole garden, we moved once last year when we moved into this unit here. But I guess we move the buckets around quite frequently. If, the weather changes, the sun changes and so on, we just pick it up and move it.
What do you reckon?
Yeah, that's pretty
That was good.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
What do you want to plant in this one?
Oh, I reckon parsley.
Yep, we could use parsley.
Yeah.
Yeah?
Mm-hmm.
And what number is it? How many of these have you got now?
I reckon this is number 40.
So you'll be able to take number 40 with you if ever you move.
Yeah, all 40 of them.
Okay, so there we go. I hope you enjoyed that video. I'll just focus in on a nice picture of them that we had in their garden so you can get a bit of a close-up. I think one of the things that is striking about Rabea and Steve for me, and I know they wouldn't mind me saying this, they're actually not super experienced. So I know them through the My Smart Garden program. We kind of found them in our toner and discovered what they were doing. And I think at this stage, they probably have less than 3 years of really seriously focusing on their food garden. So in 3 years, they've really got to the point where they're growing a substantial proportion of their fresh food. I think they say about 10%, and you would have heard 50 kilos a year from this small 4 square metre space. So it really is impressive, but it's also very achievable, I feel, for many people. And so I hope you enjoyed that example. Now, I want to just highlight a couple of things, and I've been watching the chat and some questions that have come up as well. Firstly, I just want to say, if you've got pots and you're learning about gardening, there's a huge advantage in here where you can actually test the space. You can put a pot in a corner if you're not sure if it has enough sun and see how the plant goes. And if it doesn't look like it's working, you can move it and you haven't lost the plant. So you can actually use pots like this to experiment and learn about your space, which is a real advantage. And you would have heard them say that they can just move these plants around. If they know they've got a really hot day, they can shuffle them all into the shade and they can move them back again. So there's a lot of flexibility that comes, and particularly, of course, if you need to move house as well. Now, I know there's comments and discussion going on about, is it safe to be using polystyrene, and what about plastic and so on? And I wish I had more science behind the answer, but there just doesn't seem to be a lot of researchers focusing in on these, what are quite important questions for food gardeners at home. What I will say is those buckets are food grade buckets. That's what all the food comes in that people are eating in restaurants. So I feel really quite comfortable personally about the food grade plastic buckets. and they are getting them from their local Indian restaurant. We get some from our local Indian restaurant. I'm sure lots of other restaurants have them as well, but I can say for certain Indian restaurants are getting all of their yogurt, all of their garlic, all of their ginger, I think ghee as well. They all come in in bucket form. So if you approach your local restaurants with a friendly face, I'm sure you're going to be able to access those for free. Please don't go and buy them. So I do recommend the buckets. The polystyrene boxes are a bit more controversial. These boxes you can see here are what broccoli comes transported in to many smaller shops. So they are, I guess they're food grade, but I don't know the impact of polystyrene in soil over the long term and whether there's any leaching. And certainly if you've ever been in a room with lots of polystyrene boxes, you'll know that they are off-gassing. All I can say is that they are cheap and they are readily accessible. They're often not being recycled, but everybody draws their own line somewhere with that stuff. And I'm sorry that there just doesn't seem to be much research on them being used in this way. So if it concerns you, don't use them. But your plastic food grade buckets, I feel a lot more confident in those. I also just want to point out that they're using scoria, that are volcanic rock in this video. Lots of professionals I know will actually use a bluestone type gravel, as long as it's got lots of space in between. So you don't want lots of different sizes of gravel. You actually want one that's been screened or graded so that there's going to be plenty of gaps for that water. That's another option for you. I know that some people don't even use a separate layer, and I've had reasonable success just filling these buckets up with soil and accepting that there will be a bit of a saturated layer in the bottom. Occasionally that gets a bit stinky, so you need to tip it out and let it breathe a bit in between crops. But you can experiment. This is a very flexible technology. So I just encourage you to have a play with some different systems and see if you can find one that works for you. And instead of weed matting, if you have some old shade cloth lying around, that works quite well. Lots of people use Hessian bags, and we have a lot of those from the coffee that comes into Melbourne, and they will break down over time, so you will need to reset the bucket occasionally. But again, if you don't want to use any plastic touching your food producing soil, then Hessian bags are a sort of a short-term alternative that you might like to try. So do play around with that wicking technology, and and you should be able to find materials that you can do that with for free. You can see a question about where do we get the weed mat from. That is a standard landscaping fabric that they should be able to supply at hardware stores and larger nurseries as well. And the Hessian bags, usually you have to find a place that roasts coffee. It's where the raw coffee beans come in. And of course, in Melbourne, we have lots of boutique coffee roasters around. So just do a bit of a search for coffee roasters and see if you can call them up and see if they've got a supply. But I know it's been very easy to get my hands on those in this city. Okay. Oh, one more thing, sorry, before I move on there, just have a look at that wicking box in front of you there and just note how many plants they're growing in it, because that is the other thing I think Steve and Rabea do quite well, is they don't try and pack out these pots too much. It can be really tempting when you start and you've got a tiny punnet of 6 silver beet seedlings to try and bung all of them into one of these boxes. But I think what they've got there is 2 and maybe maximum 3. But 2 silver beet plants would absolutely be enough to fill this. And for those buckets, which are about 10 litres, they're actually doing 1 silver beet plant per bucket. And that allows it to get to a really good size. You're not actually dwarfing it because there's so much competition in there. So just do think about allowing the vegetables to get to the correct size. And I have some tips on that coming a little bit later as well. And Pia's just mentioned you can get Hessian bags at vegetable grocers because potatoes come in them. Of course they do. That makes a lot of sense. Thank you, Pia. Okay, I thought I'd give you another example of a wicking bed this time. And this one's been made in a bathtub, as you can see. And so just to emphasize the point that you can retrofit all kinds of things to be wicking containers here. So it's a really nice upcycled example. Okay, so just generally talking about pots, I know a lot of you will be only working with pots. Whether they're wicking pots or not, I really think one of the keys to success here is making sure that the pot is large enough. And I see a lot of gardens on balconies and in other small spaces where the pots are only about, say, maybe 15 centimetres or 150 mil deep. And the issue with that is that the soil space is, think of it like the pantry for your plant, and it's also its water supply. And so if you've got a very small pot, it's like sending your plant out for a marathon with only a tiny little muesli bar and a tiny little thimble of water. So it's not very much for the plant to sustain itself on, and it's going to be very reliant on you to be coming back and adding things regularly. If you've got a larger pot, the temperature is much more stable as we go through these extreme heat events in Melbourne, and they have more nutrients to draw on, more root space, and just more resilience, really, is probably the word. A lot of vegetables will not grow to a full size if they're in a container that's significantly smaller than this. So I'd like to just encourage you to look for deeper containers around 300 to 400 mil deep, about 30 or 40 centimetres that is. And also consider, if you do need to move them, will you be able to lift them when they're full of soil? And I think that is actually about the limit for people to be lifting safely, because remember, these pots do get extremely heavy when they're full of particularly moist soil. The pot in front of you is one of mine. It's an old recycling tub. It happens to be UV stable as well, which is another important consideration, because of course plastic does break down when it's exposed to sunlight. So this is a particularly nice size that's working well for me. If you do want to retrofit containers, remember you're going to need to put some drainage holes in them if the container holds water. If it does hold water, you can turn it into a wicking pot as well. So you've got lots of options in there. Holly has asked me, how do you know how much depth each plant variety needs to grow in a pot? Is there a simple equation? Well, I'm just going to give you a broad rule of thumb, Holly, that most plants are going to prefer at least this 30 centimetre depth. There are some exceptions that will get away with smaller depths, and they might be things like thyme and oregano, some of those plants that tend to form a mat on the surface. And you might get away with some small leafy greens in the smaller pots. But yeah, the moisture is quite difficult keeping up to them in summer in Melbourne. So yeah, just broadly, I'd say try and have these deep pots. And Reg has said that small vertical garden systems from a well-known large hardware store have pots that are too small for most plants. And so I absolutely agree. This is my diplomatic way of saying try not to buy those pots. Cool. All right. So, and before I move on, just if you're not excited about making your own wicking pots, that's fine. And there are pots on the market which call themselves self-watering pots, which have a similar type system built in. So you can also go and purchase those if you prefer as well. There's another question around safety. If we're unsure of the material and we want to line these things, is there a fabric that we can use? A lot of people will use the thick black plastic that's used for pond lining, like a food grade plastic liner. But if your pot's already food grade, like the yogurt buckets and things that we're talking about, it's not going to add anything to that. I know certainly people do line other materials with that though as well. And Deborah, we're coming to soil soon, so we'll get into that quite shortly. Now, for people who want to grow fruit in pots, I know fruit can be a particular vexing issue because a lot of fruit plants do have deeper, larger root systems. People are always asking me, what can I definitely grow that's productive in a small space in a pot? And so I put together a list for you here. It's certainly not an exhaustive list, but it's a list nonetheless. And so I'll just quickly go through a few things. Some of them might not be as familiar to you. Firstly, blueberries, extremely popular fruit. So it's good to have things that we know people will want to eat once they've grown. They're surprisingly easy to grow, but the only thing is you must make sure that your soil is acidic. And if you're buying a potting mix, there are special acidic potting mixes for things like azalea and rhododendrons, and that will also work for blueberries. Blueberries also really like to grow in a soil that's actively decomposing and has lots of organic matter and compost. I'm going to talk about those more in a second, so just make a little bookmark in there. If you get those right, blueberries can be quite successful. I particularly want to highlight to you a variety of blueberry called Sunshine Blue, which is a very compact dwarf blueberry. It's very beautiful. It's actually kind of evergreen. It doesn't lose its leaves like other blueberries. And this one is a bit more tolerant of soil conditions that are imperfect, which makes it fantastic for beginner gardeners. So again, that's Sunshine Blue blueberries. And that's an example of one that you can see in front of you there. And they really are that productive. I'm quite excited about them. Yes, Frank's talking about acid soil. If it's okay, Frank, maybe we'll come back to that one because it's a bit of a longer answer. But that is a good question. We'll hang on to that one as well. And Helen's asked, do blueberry plants have a limited life? Oh, it's a good question. They will, but it's a fairly long-lived plant, I think. I think we'd be talking, 20 years would be my guess, Helen. Maybe someone else knows the answer to that and can look it up for me. Now, some other ones on the list that may need a little bit more explanation. The young berry is, if you think of a boysenberry, it's basically another version of that. I'm going to mention young berries particularly because they are prolific and they're quite vigorous and they seem to manage okay in pots. They are thorny though, so a bit of a disclaimer there. If you've got a small space and you don't want to be scraping past a thorny berry, maybe that one's not for you, but they're delicious, they're very easy to grow, everyone will love them. Goji berries, we can grow them in Melbourne, and they have some other benefits as well, and some other lists I'm going to share. They're really worth noting as a plant that will grow quite well in a pot. Chilean guavas, you may not know them either, but they're a delicious fruit, about the size of a blueberry, and the plant itself looks like a box hedge. It needs a little bit more moisture, but also deals well with shade, so it's on another list that is coming as well. Oh, John has said 40 to 50 years for blueberries. Fantastic, so a lot longer than I expected. Cherry guavas as well, you can look up. They're quite good in pots. Pepinos, if you haven't heard of them, a pepino or pepino dolce, they're also called, is like let's say it's like a rock melon flavour without as much of the sweetness. It's actually related to tomatoes and capsicums, and so it does very, very well in a pot. This one is maybe more of an acquired taste, so try and taste one first if you can to know that you like it, but very quick to produce fruit, usually in the first year, and does great in pots. Rhubarb you'll all know. Dwarf mulberry I'm going to talk about a bit later. Citrus can do very well in pots. Fig, most surprisingly, do seem to enjoy having constricted roots in a pot, and they may outgrow that pot eventually, but they're quite easy to establish from cuttings. And I've seen great examples of fig trees in pots. Grape as well. Sorry, I just lost my, there we go. Grape can go in a pot. And also there are lots and lots of dwarf varieties of fruit trees now that have been bred specifically to stay under 2 metres, or some of them even under 1 metre tall. So if you look for dwarf varieties of all your common fruiting favourites, you'll usually be able to grow these in a pot as well. Okay, so there's some examples in there. Now I need to keep moving, so I'm going to get on to the challenge here of lots of shade. And I wanted to show you a little path sun diagram in Melbourne as an introduction to how the sun moves through the year. And I don't think we need to get into too much technical detail here, but in Melbourne, I just want everyone to be able to picture these arcs. So in the summer, we have this high arc on the left, and then in winter, the sun really dips down to this quite low arc, and that creates long shadows that can be quite problematic for people in small gardens. So if I go to the next slide, I've got a photograph, an overhead photograph of my friend Laura's little courtyard garden. And these photographs are taken quite close to the summer and the winter solstice, which are the extent of those arcs in the sky. And they're taken around the middle of the day, with north being to the top of the page. So just have a look at this courtyard space. We've got this northern wall, which is a house wall from a neighbour's house. It's pretty much permanently in shade, so it's going to be quite a difficult growing area for most food plants. On the right-hand side, we've got the winter solstice, and you can see that the sun really disappears from a lot of that courtyard during the day. Now, the caveat on that is that if you've got open sky, in winter we have lots of cloudy days and the sun is bouncing around off them. So it doesn't mean that we can't grow food plants in these spaces, but it is going to be a little bit more restricted. So I'll give you a list of the plants that will work well in those conditions in winter. So Laura's best growing space turns out to be not the area here that she was sort of thinking of growing food, but after we'd talked about it for a while and gone around her house, it turns out some of her best growing area is actually down here near her front door, which is not an area she was thinking of growing food, but actually makes a lot of sense because it's an area that she's going to see every single day as she moves in and out of her house. And it also is going to get this lovely sun in the winter as well, making it possible for her to grow a wider range of plants. So we can actually think outside the box a little bit sometimes, and the place that we thought we might be wanting to grow food can turn out to be not the best place sometimes on our site. Now, if we need to try and make the most of a small space, this is not the greatest photo, but it's one that a wonderful participant in our program sent me. He said, check it out, look what I've done. I've put a mirror in to try and reflect some sun into my little courtyard space. And you can just see this sunny patch here on the garden bed that hasn't been planted yet. So I want to say that you can absolutely use tricks like this to enhance sun in small spaces. Another one you can do is using white paint, either on a wall permanently, or if you're renting, you could have, if you can find some piece of weatherproof board that you can paint white, you could have that leaning up against a wall to provide a really similar effect. So plants aren't really fussed where the true sun direction comes from, they just want the light. And if we think back to the picture of Annie's basil at the start of the session, and I was saying that it's south facing, but the basil seems to be doing really well, it's because there's a lot of light concrete and paving there. So any sunlight that does hit it is actually kind of bouncing around, and it's artificially improving the light in that space. So if you're in a really tiny spot, think about whether you can bounce some light in to help with the sun situation. Casey's mentioned the Sunseeker phone app, and that's a good one to mention. Thank you, Casey. So for people who are trying to work out where the sun's coming from and get some more information on that, it can be very helpful. Sally's mentioned you need to net berries against birds, and absolutely, we're not talking about pest management here so much, but absolutely blueberries are a bird's best friend if they can get to them. Okay, another technique, and again, sorry, not the greatest photo. I took this 10 minutes before the session. This is on the south side, so north is to the left of this photograph, but this is on the south side of my house and my neighbour's house. There is, I'll just highlight it for you with my mouse, a very tall birch tree here, as well as houses. And someone a long time ago planted an olive tree right in this tiny corner between fences, behind a birch tree, behind some buildings. So it's not a traditional place to stick something that really loves sun like an olive tree. But this olive tree is very productive now. And my guess is what happened is it struggled quite a bit and grew probably a bit more slowly. But once its head started to poke up above the fence line, it actually started to catch some of the sun, particularly sun that's creeping around behind us in summer, which the setting sun will do. And that's more than enough sun now for this olive to be happy and productive. So the lesson here is that if you do have a really shady spot, think about plants that might have a tall canopy that can reach up and eventually get to that sun. And particularly remember that trees that lose their leaves in winter, so deciduous trees like plums, for example, they don't actually care if there's sun or not in the winter time. So they can really make the most of these small spaces and catch some of the higher angle sun that comes through in summer as well. All right, here's the list. I know a lot of you have been waiting for this. These are some food plants that will work well in semi-shade. So I'm not going to go as far as saying shade tolerant, because there are really very few plants that will deal with complete shade. But if you've got just a couple of hours of sun or just lots of that reflected light coming in, these are the plants that I will stick behind and say are really worth an attempt for you. Definitely parsley, definitely lots of mints. Silver beet is fantastic. You can also try rocket and lettuce. Red mustard is the plant down the bottom here on the left hand side. This one is the most shade tolerant vegetable that I grow, and I can actually grow it underneath some other plants like broccolis. And then when the broccoli is harvested, it will come up and fill the space. It has an extremely hot effect on the nose, a bit like wasabi. However, if you cook it, that completely disappears and you are left with a delicious mustard flavour and a cooked green that is extremely versatile. So I do recommend red mustard if you're in a shady spot, and you can cook it and use it like a cooked green. Sweet potato, surprisingly, is really quite good in semi-shade, but you're not going to get the normal part that we would buy in the shops, the tubers. You will end up with greens though, and they are a very common cooking green in many Asian cultures. So I'd strongly recommend trying out sweet potatoes. And our native green vegetables, warrigal greens, and also bower spinach, do quite well in semi-shaded places and are certainly incredibly water efficient plants that deserve a place in many gardens. Reg has mentioned that he's growing greens in hanging baskets on the clothesline, and I meant to put in hanging baskets and I didn't, so I'm so glad that you've mentioned that one as well. And the only caveat there, of course, is that it can be quite hard to keep moisture up to those through a Melbourne summer. But if you're attentive, or if potentially you make some wicking hanging pots, then they can be a fantastic solution as well to bring those plants up high where they can get the sun. Now for fruiting plants, it's difficult for fruit to go in shade. So this is quite a short list here, but the fruits that are most well known for their ability to cope with shade are the Chilean and cherry guava that I was mentioning before. You can see the cherry guava at the top and the Chilean guava down here in a pot. Also, red and white currants are naturally understory plants as well and do reasonably well next to and tucked sort of underneath fruit trees. And also rhubarb, I've noticed, does seem to work quite well in shaded locations. So it's not an extensive list, but there still are some fruits there for the people out there with lots of shade. And don't forget, of course, that there's plenty of potential to be swapping and bartering and trading produce. So if you've got a friend with sun, see if you can exchange some of these crops with them and take some of their sun through barter. And Alex is just clarifying, yes, Alex, these fruits are all okay to grow in pots in the shade as well. Yep. So yeah, they will work for you. Now, if you've got serious shade and you're struggling, there are a couple of other options that I want to highlight. One of them is growing sprouts indoors. So you don't need any sun at all to do these. And the sprouting process for people who have not tried it is remarkably simple. So I've just done an example here for you with mustard from my pantry. And there's really two steps to this. The first one is you soak a couple of tablespoons of the seed in water overnight. And then the next day you drain it off, and every day thereon you rinse and then drain it twice a day. And you can see here that I've used actually a square from an old tea towel, but any kind of fine cloth cover will work so the seeds don't fall out. And you can just stick that straight under the tap without taking that cloth off, and then tip it and leave it in your dish draining rack. And in a couple of days, magically, you'll have sprouts. You'll notice here I've gone from mustard sprouts to mung beans, so it's not a continuum, but that's the stage that you'd start eating your sprouts, and really you can eat them at whatever stage you're ready after they start sprouting. So it really is that simple to do sprouts. And the only thing I can add to that is that seed can be quite expensive, even if you're buying sprouting seed. So the best value sprouts tend to be from seeds that you already have that can be bought for food in other contexts. That means you can get them quite cheaply. So I've popped a list down below for you of my favourite food seeds that you might be able to buy cheaply and then sprout yourself at home. And of course, they need to be fresh seeds. So if they're a packet of mung beans that you never ended up cooking with, that have sat in your pantry for 5 or 10 years, then look, they're probably not going to work. But as long as they're nice and fresh, you'll get some beautiful sprouts out of them as well. A little public safety announcement from Danny, not to eat rhubarb leaves. Thank you, Danny. Yep, the leaves contain a lot of oxalic acid, so we're just talking about eating the stems as well. And Sally's just clarified on the sprouts that we need to check the seeds have not been sprayed. If the seeds were sold for eating, and all of the ones I've listed below here would either have been sold to you as a spice or as a dried pulse, they will be fine. If you are opening random seed packets from your gardening seed box, you do need to be quite careful, because there are some seeds that have been treated with fungicides. They will say very clearly on the packet, do not eat, and not for animal consumption either. And they're often bright colours as well. If you're talking about whether the seeds are organic or non-organic, of course we can control that by buying organic lentils, organic mung beans and so on. And that's a choice that you can make as well. So I hope that clarifies it for you, Sally. Okay, and then the last one I'm going to talk about with the shade issue is, if you've got a lot of shade, have you thought about growing some mushrooms instead that don't require any of the bright sunlight that these plants prefer? And I hope you don't think I'm being lazy, but I have another Gardening Australia video for you, because the favourite way that I have found to grow mushrooms was developed by my friends Nick and Kirsten, who are, again, surprise, surprise, using those food grade plastic buckets to avoid some of the single-use plastic that can come with mushroom production. So I'm going to play this video for you where they talk about the technique that they've developed, and we'll follow it up with some resources at the end.
Growing mushrooms can sound like a mysterious business. They lurk in the damp undergrowth and seem to pop up as if by magic. Nick and Kirsten know all the secrets. Now, something tells me that these logs have a purpose being stacked like this.
They're oak logs that are being inoculated with shiitake spawn.
Shiitake are a great mushroom to grow on logs because they will grow on pretty much any hardwood. And over here we've got some woodier mushrooms growing on elder logs.
Yeah, we like mushrooms so much. We've got some ways of growing them that give us a harvest all year round. If you want to come up to the house, and we'll show you.
Yeah, definitely. So what, you're somehow replicating this up here?
Yeah, yeah, kind of. So over here we've got a whole bunch of oyster mushrooms growing in buckets.
Wow. That is amazing. It just doesn't look real.
Yeah, it's magical stuff. We grow oysters in this grow room all year round. They're quite tolerant of a bit of heat and a bit of cold.
Most of the time mushrooms are grown on disposable plastic bags. We just get these buckets in local cafes.
And you can just keep reusing them
over and over and over again.
Yep.
Now, this structure itself, to me, that looks like an old shower door. How's this put together?
Yeah, this is just junk that we've got from the local chip shop.
But if you don't have the space for this sort of setup, or you're just starting out, we started off growing mushrooms in our bathroom in a little greenhouse that we would, mist with water to keep the humidity up to.
A lot of people have a backyard pond with maybe some tree ferns or something. That can create a humid enough environment to fruit your buckets there.
So we might take you on the other side and show you how to make these.
Yeah, awesome.
All right, come with us.
I love the idea of repurposing old food-grade buckets. Nick and Kirsten have already sterilised them and got them ready.
And what we've done is we've drilled some holes in them, and then we've covered those holes in surgical tape to allow the mycelium inside to breathe.
Our first step today is preparing the substrate. We're using straw and blocks of sawdust that we need to mix together, along with a few other kickstarters. Then add some water and mix it all together.
Roll your sleeves up, Costa. We'll get in.
Here we go. Is there any technique?
Well, we just want to make sure all the blocks are wet.
Do they break? Oh, yeah, they break up.
Yeah.
Next, mix the substrate into a bag.
This is a special brewer's bag that we're using, but you can just use a pillowcase or any sort of bag you've got at this stage. So what we're doing here is we're pasteurising the straw and the sawdust by keeping it between 60 and 80 degrees Celsius for over an hour.
The hot water will kill off microorganisms and give our mycelium or spawn a chance to thrive.
And we can just close the lid, and an hour later, all that substrate will be pasteurised and ready to go.
We're also cleaning our workbench with an alcohol mix.
This is drained for about half an hour, so it's not dripping anymore. And now we're going to tip it out on the table and inoculate it.
So now that the substrate is at the right temperature, we can add the spawn.
We just crumble it out and break it up as we go.
Interesting colour in there.
So this is all fluffy with the mycelium of the summer white oyster mushroom.
When you're foraging mushrooms, you have to be super careful about what you're picking. But that's one of the great things about growing them yourself this way. The spawn that you buy is going to determine exactly what species of mushroom you're going to grow. So there's no confusion.
Now we're just going to mix this in really, really well and distribute the spawn equally.
So we're just going to get as much of this stuff into the buckets as we can.
So you have to compact it?
Yeah, the more we get in here, the more mushrooms we get.
Ah,
yeah.
Oh, that sounds like good motivation. It will sit at room temperature, or about 23 to 25 degrees, for 2 to 4 weeks until it looks like it's ready to fruit.
Here's one that we did a few weeks back.
Wow.
So the mycelium has fully colonised the straw and the sawdust. This is the point when it's ready to start to produce the mushrooms, and we can trigger that by moving it into our superhumid environment, you know, in our case, our fruiting chamber.
And once they're in that humid environment, the mushrooms will fruit out of these holes, they'll push past the surgical tape and they'll fruit out from there. Watching any plant bloom or fruit is beautiful, but mushrooms are just so special.
Yeah, they're kind of alien, and we love that.
Yeah.
This property is incredibly productive for its size. And it goes to show that you don't need a whole lot of space to grow your own food. And when it comes to food miles, it doesn't get much closer than your own backyard.
All right, let's pause it there. I can see a lot of chat going on of excited people who are going to give this a go. There was a question about how they sterilise the buckets. There's quite a few different ways, Lucy. I think when we did it, we actually just tipped boiling water through them. But yeah, there are some other low-tech, easy ways to do it as well. You need to buy the spawn, as you've seen in that video. I think my partner got some from a place called Aussie Mushroom Supplies, and I can see there's a link that's been put in the chat as well for some other materials. It costs about $50 to buy 2 kilos of spawn, so there is a bit of an investment there. That will grow a very substantial number of mushrooms though, so it really does make them quite affordable to grow. If you can split that with a friend, perhaps you can get a better deal there as well, because you only need a tiny amount of spawn. But anyway, growing mushrooms, exciting option for people. You can do it indoors, you can do it outdoors in shaded, humid places. So I hope that opens up some potential for those of you who are feeling a bit depressed about how much sun you may or may not have. Now, at this stage, I think we're going to pause. I'm going to ask, maybe we have a 5-minute break I'm going to stick around here if there's any questions on what we've just covered, and then we're going to get into soil, water and plant selection. So if I could ask if we start again at 11:20, please, but do feel free to chat to me during the break with any questions that you might have.
Amazing, thanks Kat. We'll see you all in about 6-7 minutes. Cool. We have had a question from Janice. Is inhaling mushroom spores a danger when growing them indoors?
Yeah, I don't believe so, Janice. It's a good question though, and for people who might be particularly sensitive, I'd maybe say do it outdoors if you've got any concerns. You notice that Nick and Kirsten there did have them contained inside a greenhouse as well. We did ours just in the open in our bathroom and didn't have any issues. But I'm certainly not a medical expert in that sense. So if you're concerned, please do your own research. Linda, you've got need some hints for growing basil. I wonder if you've tried it before and if something's gone wrong, and you can tell me what went wrong, and I might be able to give you some better tips.
Sorry. I've never grown it before, so I've put in quite a lot of seeds in a big great big pot, and also in some self-watering containers, but nothing's coming up. They've been in the ground for weeks.
Okay, yeah, so basil, probably one of the big tricks with it is a very warm soil crop, and I'm assuming that you're in Melbourne, Linda. So I've only just planted my seedlings now, and I've noticed that when I've planted them along with most of my other plants in spring, they really struggle, and we seem to be having quite a cold year this year generally. I've actually got a hot water bottle on my lap at the moment because it's still quite cold where I live. So I'd suggest maybe soil temperature is the thing that's going wrong there. With seeds, particularly plants with really small fine seeds like basil, they also can be among the trickiest for beginners if you don't have a lot of seed raising experience. So I'd always recommend people try seedlings first if you're not having any luck with those seeds.
Should I bring them inside, the big pots inside?
Yeah, I would. And look, I actually plant my tomatoes in mid-July indoors, and I use my indoor space like a heat greenhouse. And
so
I take them outside during the day to get sun, and then I bring them back inside at night to get that warmth. So you can certainly absolutely play around with that. Some people have a heated space on top of their hot water service that you can come and use seed raising as well, and that can help to get them started. Okay, I'm going to go to Catherine's question now. Can you grow your own spawn? You can. It's a little bit more of a specialised process though, Catherine, and it involves some more hardcore sterilisation. I don't know much about it either, so I'm not going to be a good source for you. Nick and Kirsten from Milkwood though run mushroom courses, and they teach people how to do that. And so that'd be a great source if you want to go that extra step. And I've noticed Steph has put up a great learning lab for mycology in Melbourne is myco.org.au. So I'm making some notes of that now, Steph, and I'm going to check that out as well. Thank you. And Noah's asking, can tomatoes be overwintered in containers indoors? Maybe, yeah, if they're still going to need some sun. So if you've got a sunny enough spot indoors and the temperature doesn't drop too low, then absolutely. I've got friends that live actually at Meliadora in the video that you just saw, and they have a greenhouse tacked onto the front of the building there, and they get tomatoes through the winter in a much colder climate to suburban Melbourne. So I'm going to say yes if you've got a sunny enough space for them.
Lots of interest in mushrooms. It's amazing.
Yeah, I thought there might be.
I've only ever tried from those boxes that you can buy. Like I was giving them as a gift, and found that it was cool watching it grow, but you needed to do a lot of maintenance and spraying, and then it didn't actually produce that many mushrooms in the end. And I think they are really expensive, those boxes. So that's a good option.
Compared the price per box to the price per kilo of mushrooms and done the same calculation myself and thought this is a lovely experience, but not really a serious food prospect for the long term, unfortunately. So that's
maybe a good gift to generate interest in growing mushrooms, and then and graduate on to doing it yourself.
Absolutely. And yeah, so you can grow a phenomenal amount of mushrooms from a bag of spawn quite cheap. So yeah, it does make a lot more economic sense.
Yeah. I like the thought of apartment buildings, the bathrooms being filled with mushrooms growing, showers of mushroom farms.
You know what I love is just how many things you can do with these food grade plastic buckets. We run our whole system on them for waterers for our little quail and storage, and we're going to look at some composting systems coming up soon that use them, and they are just a bit of a wonder.
Yeah, really cool, and that they're pretty readily available and possibly otherwise just being recycled through the system. So
absolutely. Melissa's asked about raspberries. Yeah, you definitely can. You can grow raspberries in pots. In fact, raspberries are almost better in pots in some ways, Melissa, because they have this tendency to sucker, which means putting up small plants everywhere and spreading well beyond the area that you planted them. So you can contain that to great effect by growing them in a pot. Definitely have a go. Yeah, they'll deal with heart sun only, but they wouldn't be one of my top plants for shaded areas if that's part of your challenge. Okay, so on my clock it's just gone 11:21, and I'm going to keep going. Is that all right with you, Beck?
Yes, that is all good with me. There's yeah, I'll do more questions at the end.
I'm going to trust that people are coming back from cups of tea that they've just made and launch straight into it. And we're going to come back and look at soil now. So as I said at the start, like, this is an expansive topic. It takes us 3 hours to just skim the surface of all the things that you need to know about soil as a gardener. So this really is the essential information only. And I strongly encourage people to have a look on the My Smart Garden website, where we do have a session, Know Your Soils, and you can really go into much more depth on these topics. But I guess the most important stuff for people who are getting started growing, and particularly in pots, is to know that soil is an incredible thing, and it can be improved dramatically with good care. So a lot of people will say to me, oh, my soil's rubbish, I need new soil. And the answer that I'll give to that is, well, you probably don't need new soil. It just needs to be soil that is managed well over time. The only times I really encourage people to get new soil is where there currently isn't anywhere on their site, and in cases where there might be some contamination in the soil. And I haven't put it in the slides, but I will just type in the chat box. There's a program called Veggie Safe that runs out of Macquarie University in New South Wales, and you can send them soil samples from anywhere in Australia, and they will test it for the top 5 heavy metal contaminants. And it's particularly lead that we worry about in soils, and that does get covered extensively in the soil session that I've just mentioned, I think. So please check that out. If you're concerned, send off the soil sample. What I'd really like to focus on today is for people growing in really small spaces and growing in pots. How do we know what type of soil to use? And also, is potting mix good, and what's the difference between them? So soil is made up of a mix of mineral particles, sand, silt and clay. It also has water and air, and it has a small percentage, but a very significant proportion of organic matter, which we're going to look at in just a second. And that organic matter contains life. It's food for your plants in very simple terms, and it creates this, in healthy soil, this wonderful structure that's crumbly, and it also holds moisture. It does a lot of the work in terms of keeping your soil and then your plants healthy. Potting mix, on the other hand, is usually a mix of partly broken down bark. It doesn't contain a lot of those mineral components, although it might contain some sand in there. Potting mix is often sold with chemical fertilizers to stimulate growth. It doesn't tend to have a lot of things like compost in it, although some good brands will. Now, I want to acknowledge here that the standard horticultural advice is to always use potting mix if you're growing in pots, and to make sure that you buy premium potting mix if you possibly can, because the premium potting mix tends to be the one that is going to produce good results, which is very important, of course, in food gardens, that they have a much lower tolerance for poor soil than something like an ornamental plant in a pot. My own personal experience has been very disappointing when it comes to growing food in potting mix. So I don't want to say don't do that, particularly because it's going against a lot of horticultural wisdom. I just want to point out, though, that you can very much grow food in pots using a sandy soil mix, and I found that a lot easier to sustain good results over the long term. One of the real issues with potting mix is that if it does dry out, it can be very difficult to re-moisten it and bring it back into health. So I just want to acknowledge the difference in there in my advice and encourage you to do your own tests, and say, I grow all of my veggies in sandy soil in pots. So what I mean by sandy soil is if you make a ball or scrunch some soil up in your hands, moisten it a little bit and rub it together, you'll feel those sand grains in there. You won't be able to make a sausage with it. That would be a clay soil type, which can be quite difficult in pots. So we're really talking about quite a loose, open, aerated soil that comes from having lots of those big sand particles in there. Jennifer has asked, can we use compost all the way, even in pots? Look, maybe compost, because it holds so much water, it can sometimes just become too boggy, Jennifer. But no doubt some plants thrive on pure compost. The thing about compost, and we are coming on to that topic now, is that it's used up, so it needs to be constantly replaced. And it's also probably a bit of a waste, because we don't need anywhere near that amount of compost. So let me just talk about compost and organic matter in a second, and I'll tell you what I would recommend. Wendy said, I was told the only difference between good and expensive potting mix is the addition of fertiliser. No, I think it's maybe a little bit more nuanced than that. But certainly the premium potting mixes are going to have a better rounded balance of nutrients in there. And you will find some potting mixes now that are specifically for vegetables that will keep the balance and what they need in mind. And Pauline's asked, can you reuse potting mix? You absolutely can. So don't throw out potting mix. The reviving process, if it's really dried out, is to submerge it in water and force it to become wet again, which can be quite hard if it's really dried out. And then also to be adding this organic matter. So let's move on to that now, so that I can clear that up for you. And so organic matter is anything that's lived before: leaves, twigs, animal manures. As gardeners, usually what we're adding is compost and mulch. So compost is like a broken down, stabilized form of these things that used to be grass clippings, leaves, etc. It's all been broken down by microorganisms, and it's in this lovely, stable, concentrated form that we then add to the soil, and then that goes on to feed the plants. Organic matter is used up. So in the same way that you need to continuously add food for your body, we need to be replenishing the organic matter. So it's not something that we can add once and then forget. It has to be constantly cycled. Now I'll just show you one of my beds at home from the winter when I planted it. And I do exactly the same thing in pots as I do in the beds, and with great results. So that is, every time I'm replanting vegetables, I'm adding about a 1 to 2 inch, let's say 3 to 5 centimetre layer of compost or worm castings across the whole surface of the pot or the bed. It's probably a bit more than what most people think, but it's certainly a lot less than filling the entire bed or pot with compost, just referring back to the question I received a minute ago. And that's enough for most vegetables to do really well, but sometimes I'll add a little bit of something extra that's richer in fertiliser. So for me, that's some poultry manure that I get from my quail aviary, about a handful per square metre. But you can also use things like blood and bone, for example, as well, or organic fertiliser pellets, and so on. So we've got options there, and that's just to top up some of the nutrients for really hungry vegetables. Things like your cabbages, for example, or things like your zucchini as well. Now I'm also adding mulch as well, which protects the soil surface and keeps all the moisture in the soil, protects the soil life, stops the soil from being baked by the sun or from washing away, and so on. Now I'm just going to go back a sec because I've got some questions on potting mix recipes and percentages of soil and sand. I don't have a potting mix recipe, so I will, if I did need to use potting mix, I would buy some. The sandy soil, I'm going to say if you've got sandy soil already somewhere around you, you can use that if you have no contamination concerns. Otherwise, you're getting it from a landscaping supplier. It's pretty rare for them to sell clay-rich soils, so you're either very good that it's going to be a sandy soil, but you can check it just using that test that I talked about before of scrunching some up with a bit of water and massaging it and just feeling for those sand grains and making sure that you can't make a sausage, which would be a clear sign that you've got a clay soil there as well. Good, and there's some other suggestions in the chat that I'll leave you to read as well. Deb is asking me, you put the compost on top rather than dig it into the soil, and yeah, that's right, Deb. So I will spread it out and then just with a garden fork gently lever it in, just use that fork to open the soil up a little bit and at the same time tickle it into the top, and that will just help the plant roots to get access to it more quickly and protect it from any sun or anything that might gas off some of the nutrients in it. Okay, so I realised that was a quick flick through. There's so many more questions in there, but I just have to leave it there on soil. But please go check out some of the resources in My Smart Garden and get answers to those other important questions there as well. Now, so I've talked about compost, and the other thing is worm compost or vermicast. It's basically the same thing, same result. I use the same quantities and so on. So I want to talk about some of the other, like the systems that you can use on a very small scale to be producing your own compost that you can use in your garden. And one of the things I wanted to mention is worm farms, extremely popular, but there are some things I want to say about them. One of them is that they deal with very small amounts and consistent amounts of fruit and veg waste. And we're I'd say a very waste efficient kitchen here, and we have only probably about a litre of veg scraps and things every day or two. We have 3 worm farms, ones that I've made myself actually, but similar size to the photograph in the middle. So one of the common failings with worm farms is just piling the food scraps on, and the worms can't manage that amount, and then it starts to stink and the worms get unhappy and they start to decline. So worm farms work well if you've got enough of them for the amount of waste you're producing, and if there's a nice consistent flow of fruit and veg waste. They don't deal well with lots of bread. I certainly wouldn't recommend putting things like meat in there or citrus or lots of onion. So it's actually quite a kind of a defined range of foods that they do well on. The other thing is they've got to be in somewhere that's cool and sheltered during summer in Melbourne, especially with black worm farms that really trap that heat and attract it. And so if you don't have anywhere that's in full shade through summer, then I don't recommend worm farms for you, because the threshold for worms dying is about 35 degrees in their bedding in the soil area. And we just easily go over that in a Melbourne summer many times. Finally, I just want to say that they're an animal, so it's like caring for an animal. So they do need this careful management. And my experience of worm farms has been that if you don't prioritise worms highly in your life, and it breaks my heart, but most people don't, that they probably aren't the best choice, because they have a very high failure rate. And if your worms do fail and you need to restart them, we can be looking about 6 months before they can build up again and start to eat a considerable amount of your food scraps again. So I love worms. I've got worms here. I just want to acknowledge that they're probably not the easiest option for people looking to recycle food waste at home. So let's have a look at 2 other options quickly that you might consider. One of them is Bokashi composting. Now this is sort of a half solution. It really holds on to the waste until you can find somewhere to compost or bury it. And it does this using what we call Bokashi bran or grain, which is this stuff you can see being sprinkled on the top here. And that has been inoculated with microorganisms that are going to pleasantly ferment your food waste rather than allow it to go putrid and start to stink. So most people will have the Bokashi bucket in their kitchen, so like indoors, and it is pleasant enough to manage that for most people. And you will add your food scraps every day. You will sprinkle them with a little amount of the grain, certainly not as much as in the photograph, or it'll cost you a lot of money. And then you will squash it down with a potato masher or some similar instrument. And you will, every week at least or so, you'll drain off liquid through the tap at the bottom of the bucket. You can make your own Bokashi buckets, by the way. There's lots of tutorials on the internet to do that. There's nothing very special about them. And then once the bucket's full, that waste will be pre-fermented. So when you bury it somewhere in the ground or you add it to a friend's compost system, it will break down surprisingly quickly. And I have many, many friends that live in apartment blocks and surreptitiously bury a bucket of Bokashi somewhere in the landscaping around the building in a different place every time, once every couple of weeks. So look, that might be an option for you. And then, you know, the thing is, if you want to get that compost back to grow food, you'll need somewhere that you can retrieve the Bokashi once it's broken down. Sandra's asking, can you just dig vegetable peelings into the garden? Yeah, you can. I'd recommend that you do them about a foot deep, just so like rodents and animals aren't attracted to them. And you do them between your rows of plants so that by the time the plants get large enough, Sandra, they've actually already started to decompose. It's called trench composting. It's a time-honoured method. And if you've got enough space to do that, then yep, that's another great option for you as well. I got to leave Bokashi there because I want to take you to one of my favourites, which is compost in those plastic buckets that we've been looking at so much already. And you would have seen Steve with his compost system in the video before. And we often think of compost as being something that takes a lot of space, but they've actually created their own system, which is working beautifully. And you can see behind Steve here, he's got about maybe 4 or 5 of these buckets stacked up high behind a camellia. It's really not taking very much space at all in their tiny courtyard garden. Now, I got the inside goss from Steve before the session, and to retrofit these buckets, he's put an 8mm hole in the centre of the bottom of the bucket and a couple of those around the edges of the base, about 4 around the edges of the base. They're 8mm so that worms can get in, but rodents can't. And then in the lid, he says he's put about 33mm holes, which prevents most flies from getting in there and still allows the box to breathe. And then indoors in their kitchen, they've got a solid, uninterfered with 10-litre bucket where they collect their food scraps and they sprinkle it with a mix of sawdust and some soil or compost to help get it started. And once that's full, they will empty it into one of these buckets outdoors for composting. And he does use a compost screw, and I really like these as well, just to aerate those buckets while they're breaking down. I'm going to guess, Cam, it would take probably about somewhere between 3 and 6 months for those buckets to break down. It depends a bit on how actively you manage it and how warm the conditions are. So it's hard to be precise, but we'd be looking at 3 to 6 months within that range. And this is really some of the best compost I've ever seen produced in a home garden. And it's happening in a system that's scalable and portable and very compact as well. So I think it's quite an exciting spot. It can go in the shade and it could also go in a sunnier spot if you had one as well, and that would help it to break down a bit faster. So I just wanted to mention to you, when you're looking at designing your system, that compost is probably one of the most flexible systems. And if you go away on holidays, for example, it won't matter. And it's very resilient. If something goes wrong, you can restart straight away without having to breed up more worms. There aren't ongoing costs as long as you've got a free supply of something carbon rich like sawdust or wood shavings or shredded paper and so on. Make sure that's clean sawdust, by the way. We don't want any paint or treated timber or varnish or anything else in there that we wouldn't want to be eating, of course. Holly's said, does it cut off the air if he stacks them. Look, I guess it must a little bit, but it's working, so I guess it doesn't matter. I presume he's getting in there and swapping them around and aerating them a bit as well. It certainly seems to be working fine. Okay, so I'm going to leave because I want to move on to some other topics now. I want to mention water briefly, and one of the other challenges I know a lot of people face in small spaces is sometimes there's too much sun. If you've got a fully west-facing balcony in Melbourne, then your temperatures are going to really heat up in those summer afternoons, and that can be very stressful for a lot of plants. So I want to mention that people sometimes use plants to create a bit more of a pleasant space. And this is my grapevine at home that's on a pergola. And I've got this wonderful example from a woman called Kate who lives in Stonington, who Beck shared some of these photographs with me. And you can see she's used a grape here to just provide a bit more cover over their outdoor living space. And that would also protect some of the plants as well. And in the left-hand corner down here, if you've just got a lot of concrete and rendered areas that are attracting heat, a lot of people will use a plant like Boston ivy to just help to insulate against some of that and keep the space cool. So that can be fantastic for your indoor spaces, but you could also use it just to reduce a bit of the thermal mass that takes on all that heat in our hot summers in Melbourne. Now, it's an obvious point, I know, but it does take water to grow food. So the trick is to use just enough, but not too much. And I always like to show people this photograph of carrots that were grown from the same variety, the same time, in the same bed, the same row even. The only difference is the ones on the bottom were at the edges of the bed where they dried out, and the ones in the middle got the perfect moisture from my management. So it really is the deal breaker. And if you're someone who's been a bit disappointed with your results in the past, probably one of the things is water, because it seems to be the thing that so many people don't quite nail on their first attempt. So how do we get the water right? Well, for most common vegetables, finger testing is your best guide, and that means poking your finger into the soil and feeling for moisture. Does it feel a little bit cool, a little bit damp? Is your finger a bit dirty when it comes out? That's a good sign there's some moisture in there. If it's not, then it might be time to give it a water. So that's the rule of thumb that I use, and that a lot of my friends who are market gardeners and farmers use as well. So it's simple, but it does work. And unfortunately, you will still need to water in winter in Melbourne. And if you've got an overhang on your balcony or some tall walls that are blocking the rain, you might be surprised by how little rain actually makes it into your soil. So this is how we actually check what's really going on for our plants. And we can't assume that just having drops of water on the leaves means that there's actual soil moisture that they're able to use. Okay, so use the finger test to check whether you're watering enough or too much potentially. And I wanted to give you some tricks for people growing in pots. Of course, wicking pots are fantastic, and we've looked at those extensively already. But if you don't have wicking pots, you can use a deep saucer like I've got here, and make sure that's full on a hot day. And that for me has been the secret for getting some of these pots through a Melbourne heat wave. So that just gives them a little bit of extra water. You can also bury an ice cream container, an empty ice cream container, in the bottom inside your pots, and that will collect water as you water it and allow that water to wick back up. It's like a kind of basic wicking system within a normal pot, and that will work. Reg is just highlighting that the tops were tastier than the actual carrots. Oh, we're going to come to things like that soon, but that's great to know, Reg. What can you use for a big saucer? Oh, look, anything that fulfills the function of holding a bit of water. I find these in hard rubbish all the time, but people throw these out a lot. You can, of course, buy them from nurseries and hardware shops as well. And yeah, I look for ones that are about 3 or maybe 5 centimetres deep for a pot this size. Cam's asked, how deep can a wicking pot go? Well, it's a good question, Sam. So the wicking effect actually works up to about, I think, about 30 centimetres or 300 mil. And it doesn't actually draw much further on its own. So yeah, usually the soil layer in a wicking pot will be limited to about 300 mil deep. Okay, and then finally, the other tips I had were making leaky bottles. So if you've got like a 2-litre juice container or milk container, you can heat a pin up very carefully over a candle and then poke a hole in the bottom, just a tiny hole, and you can fill that bottle up with water, loosen the lid slightly so it can drain, and that will drip out slowly over hot days and can fulfill a similar effect. So that can be a nice trick for Melbourne heat waves as well. Now, I'm going to rush a little bit. I'm looking at my clock. So here's a list of heat tolerant plants for small spaces. And I'm particularly highlighting for you the wild rocket, which is a different species to what most gardeners will be offered as rocket as seedlings or seeds. So make sure you check that scientific name. You can see it growing in paving here. It really is that tough. And this is one of the most useful plants that we can be growing at home. Most people love it and they've already eaten it in cafes or restaurants. So I just want to especially highlight that one for heat spaces. Okay, fruit, heat tolerant fruit. I love mulberries, specifically dwarf black mulberries that you can grow in a pot. This is a particularly dwarf commercial version. But there are other ones that will grow to about 2 metres and they do spectacularly well in pots. And we've also got some other examples there for you as well that you can consider. Okay, so finally, moving on to plant selection. And this really is going to be a balance between what you personally like to eat, which is different for everyone, of course, what yields really well given the small space that you've got, what perhaps saves you money if that's one of your goals. And also, of course, it must be suited to your growing conditions. So I hope that I've given you a few lists now of particular challenging conditions that you might be able to look through. They're absolutely not exhaustive and you can certainly do your own research and find other examples out there. But that would be my picks for most people where to start. Now, thinking all this through, and I know I've said this 2 or 3 times now, if you've got a very small space, most people will find doing herbs and doing leafy greens makes the most of that small space and gives them real bang for buck and produces a great amount in a small area. So if you're wondering where to start, that would be my suggestion. On top of that, I've got a couple of tips to help you make the most of really small spaces. And one of them comes back to what Reg was saying before around eating carrot tops and them being better than the actual carrots. And so I highly endorse using all parts that are edible of a plant. So for example, in the photographs you can see here, I've got some broccoli that I grew when I first moved in. I was very happy with it, but in a small house, you don't want a whole head of broccoli that you've got to finish by eating broccoli in every single meal for a week. You actually want small, consistent amounts of produce over a longer period. So I actually grow the plant on the left now, which is sprouting broccoli, because I can have a nice, consistent harvest over 2 or 3 months, as long as I don't let it flower. And I can eat the stems and the leaves, which are much more tender and nice to eat than some of the large, tough broccoli leaves, although those are also edible, I should mention. So we're looking for plants where you can eat most of the plant for most of the time that it's in the ground, and fantastic if there are bonus edible parts, because that can double or triple your yield in some cases. So what I'd like to do is crowdsource some examples of this. If you have got some vegetables that you're eating unconventional parts of, let us know through the chat window and we'll have a look at some of those in a second. Next thing is seek out high yielding varieties and if possible, grow them side by side and do your own trials to find out what is working for you. The Diggers Club, very famous heirloom seed company and gardening club in Australia, do tomato trials, and the range of yields with different varieties goes from 2 kilos under good conditions and professional management up to 20 kilos for the Tigerella tomato. So that is a fabulous range of different yield potentials. And so I don't grow Tigerellas here because they don't yield very well for me. But the key here is that there is a range out there. So I want to encourage you to keep trying as many different varieties as you can of the vegetables that you like. until you find the ones that are working really well in your soil with your management and your microclimate. So I grow rattlesnake beans, and if we were in the room together, I'd be handing out rattlesnake beans to all of you to see if it was a good bean for your conditions. But just please try different varieties until you find ones that are working well. And of course, you can also ask other gardeners and local gardening clubs, ask people what their best yielding varieties are and see if you can adopt them as well. This is probably one of the biggest factors in increasing my yields around here. So just keep testing until you find what works. And then of course, grow up vertical space. And I got some overhead footage from Gardening Australia when they came here. So I was just going to play you a quick shot of that so you can see how vertical my garden space is. And then I think there's a photograph from the side. Yep, there we go. So if you can, try to grow things vertically, because usually climbing versions will yield 2 or even 3 times as much as a dwarf bush shape. So that applies for things like beans and tomatoes, for example. Use trees. You can grow things up trees, trellises, fences, of course. It just magnifies the yield that is possible. Unfortunately, though, if you're in a very windy position, like a balcony or a rooftop, you're going to need to look for short and sturdy varieties instead. And there is, for example, there's a project called the Dwarf Tomato Project, where there's home gardeners like you and I that are breeding exciting, small, sturdy, compact tomato varieties. So they are out there. But if you can, try and use vertical space to great advantage. Then I also wanted to recommend succession planting to make sure that you get a long harvest out of your space. And so, for example, in this garden bed, which is literally some photos I took this morning, on the right-hand side here, if I circle it, I've got zucchinis, 2 zucchinis. I've got 2 poles with beans growing up, a couple of beans on each. Then I've got some climbing strings that I'm growing cucumbers up. I've got 4 of those. And then there's kind of a divider between this half of the bed and the next half. And I will repeat that pattern, probably starting seed in the next 2 weeks. And I'll have exactly the same pattern in reverse growing on the other side of the bed. And that's because I found that all these crops peter out a little bit earlier than the season. So I can actually have more of them if I plant them in 2 waves in my garden. But in the meantime, what I'm filling that other space with is really quick growing crops like radishes, coriander, and also I've got a patch of lettuce here as well. So I'm not allowing that space to be dormant, and it's actually better for the soil if there's plants in there because it stabilizes the soil. But I'm getting some other crops, catch crops, if you like, before the main crops come in. The other thing going on here is I've got some of that lovely red mustard that was almost in full shade underneath cauliflowers through the winter that was planted along the very back edge of this bed. And it dealt with that shade all through the winter months. And as soon as I ate all the cauliflowers and cut them out, look at how much it's grown up and bloomed. So I'm actually finding all these little niches and microclimates. I've just remembered I've got that wild rocket growing along this front edge, which gets very hot and dry. So you can see how I'm sort of stacking things in space and also in time, and just working to find good arrangements of these plants that won't compete heavily with each other. So there's a few examples in the bottom of your screen there of things that I tend to think of as succession planting candidates. Zucchini, bean, cucumber, corn, radish, beetroot, lettuce, and rocket. And it's quite a lot more as well, but there's some basic ones to get you started. I am looking at all your questions. I'm also looking at the clock, so hang on to them and we'll come back to them at the official end of the session. I can stay as long as you like to get some of those questions answered for you. But I'm going to stay with just the planting tips for now to make sure we cover them off. And some of the final advice I guess I have is probably targeted more at those of you who identify as beginners, because some of the early mistakes that I was making, as I alluded to before, was really cramming in plants. And what I realized through trial and error was that you don't necessarily get more tomatoes. If you plant 20 tomatoes in a bed, you just get 20 stressed tomatoes, whereas you actually get more if you only plant 5 or 6, if that was the space that they required. So the discipline, I guess, is to look at your seed packets and check the labels of your seedlings for the recommended spacings, and do your best to follow those, at least initially, while you're learning what's possible. And over time, you'll be able to sneak things in around the edges and maybe put things a little bit closer together. And so you'll learn what the tolerance is for these plants. But initially, if you're hoping to get good yields, it is a good idea to follow those. Now, just a quick tip in there, if you see a seed packet where it's got, you know, like 20 by 50, as in like you might have plants 20 centimetres apart in rows of 50 or something like that, that all gets very confusing. So for planting in beds like this, where you don't need to access the plants by walking down a row, I will add those two numbers together and then halve them to get the block size, if you like, for each plant. So 20 plus 50 is 70, divided by 2 would be 35. So I have plants 35 centimetres apart. I hope that makes sense to you. So it's just arranging them slightly differently when you're growing in pots and growing in beds. So not very sexy advice, I know, but very important. And the other one is, of course, we want taller plants, usually on the southern side in Melbourne, where the sun comes from the north, to make sure that we're not shading out any of these other plants, especially in the winter. So for the bed that you can see in front of you in this photograph, I know you can't quite tell the angle, so you'll have to trust me. This is like a wedge that moves up as you go towards the back, so that the sun can come in and reach all these little radicchios and daikons, and then the really big tall cauliflowers at the back are not shading them. With planting, I also try and put the things I'm going to pick all the time around the edges, so that the wild rocket, again, as a salad I eat almost every day, is around the edges so that I can access it easily. And if I have things that are a bit more awkward to harvest, I try and put them, well, I'll put them in the centre. So I only need to harvest them once, so I'll just go into the centre and be inconvenienced once, for example. So I call them the pick onces and the pick offens, and that's another organising factor that I use all the time. And the other one that's worth considering is if you've got plants with similar requirements, like, you know, they all need to be netted to protect them from cabbage white butterflies that lay eggs that turn into caterpillars. So I'll actually put all my brassicas in one bed so that I can have one net that deals with that problem all at once. So they're the basics, really. There's so much more detail in there, but I think those are the most important ones I wanted to mention for beginners. And you can see I actually do some sketches of my garden, and I actually have almost a script now, which I just repeat, and I rotate the beds so that the script kind of moves one bed over for every year. But I can tell you that I can only fit 5 or maximum 6 tomatoes, and I can tell you what bed they'll be in any year in the future. It's a very easy system now that I've worked on it. So this is not essential, of course, but those of you who are really hoping to pump up the yields, it does help to have some kind of a plan that you can correct slowly mistakes and evolve your plan over time to suit what you want in the kitchen. All right, so coming to the end of the official stuff I wanted to share, I'm just going to flag a couple of resources for you. I didn't get around to putting it in here, but as well as my own Instagram, there's another one that I love called Up on the Rooftop, which is a fabulous woman running a balcony garden, I think up in New South Wales. It's very inspiring, so I do recommend that one as well. If you've got favourite small space gardens on Instagram that you follow, please pop them in the chat. And that'd be a great resource for people who are looking to get some more inspiration and tips as well. I also want to highlight the program. I'm sure Beck's going to do a wrap up about My Smart Garden, but that's the website, and we also have an Instagram account as well. And finally, I'm, I guess, a part of a little project called Retro Suburbia, which is a permaculture-based project helping to transform the suburbs into beautiful, livable places. And there's an online version where you can pay as you feel to have full online access to that book, or there's a really substantial book that most libraries have as well. So I'm going to hand back to Beck, but I know there's lots of questions, and if Beck's happy to stay and happy for me to stay, I will continue after the official end, and we can just come back to your questions and make sure that we don't miss too many. So I thank you so much for your time. I know it's a bit of a whirlwind. I hope that there's enough in there to help you break through some of the barriers that you might be facing and give you some ideas of where to start and what to learn next. So all the best.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Kat. I reckon there's probably lots of silent applause from the 100 people who are on this call. So it's always a huge pleasure to listen. I can't speak after a little bit of time off. It's a huge pleasure to listen to your sessions, Kat. And this one today, there's obviously so much that we can all do in our spaces, no matter what size. And I think you've really shown that with some amazing examples and so many good tips in there. So I reckon there's something for everyone to go away with. And yeah, great resources there as well. I wanted to flag that the Stonington Libraries have some amazing gardening resources available through the libraries, and our libraries will be opening back up along with lots of Melbourne libraries on the 16th of November. So you can always check out their collection there. And I did want to do a plug for the My Smart Garden program, which we've mentioned throughout, and I've been linking lots of resources on it through the chat, but I'll send it out after this session as well. But there's heaps of really amazing events coming up over the next few months, learning about bees, how to make seed bombs to attract bees to your garden, interactive, there's going to be an interactive food gardening question and answer, edible weeds and in your garden and neighbourhood, plus some sessions to help you prepare for summer as well, which this one this morning has been a really good start for those heat tolerant plants as well. And just from the City of Stonington, we do have a webinar coming up next week that's also about preparing for summer, but for your home. So yeah, basically energy efficiency improvements that you can make to save on your energy bill and also reduce your impact and carbon emissions. And the Stonington Libraries, so this event is a partnership with Stonington Libraries, and they have an amazing literary festival coming up with a huge lineup of amazing and award-winning authors, including Clementine Ford, Bree Lee and Heather Morris, and lots more amazing authors. So do check that out, and I'll send a link following this email. But I did just want to make one request of you all before I finish up. After all our webinars, we really like to ask people to take a moment to reflect and think about one thing that they want to implement, and I'm sure there's many, but I just want you to focus down, hone in on one action that you want to take following this webinar. So and take a moment to write it down, or if you'd like to share it in the chat as well. I'd be really interested to see. That would be really, really lovely. And I will send out a survey following this webinar to grab some feedback from you all and help us to improve events like this. But I want to say a huge thank you to Kat Lavers for joining us this morning. It's always a pleasure, and thank you all for joining us. Great response to this webinar, particularly as Kat said at the beginning, whilst our city is open back up and there's lots of options for you. So I hope you can go off into the day, maybe spend some time in your garden or your small space, or just enjoy the freedoms that we have in Melbourne, and hope to see you at another environmental event soon. So over to you, Kat, and we'll get through some more questions. There's lots of actions coming through which are going to move the questions out of the way. But if you'd like to now pop your burning questions in the chat, that would be amazing, and we'll try to tackle some of them. There's lots of cool actions coming through. Starting a worm farm.
I know we missed a few questions back there, but I'm not sure who's staying on the call. So if you did, if you wouldn't mind just popping it back in the chat window, hopefully you can copy and paste.
Yes. Olivia has a great question. What's a good climber for a small balcony? A large wall on two sides of Olivia's balcony.
Okay, so if we're talking about food plants and you can erect some kind of trellis, then I think I mentioned things like grapes, which will give you sun in the winter when they drop their leaves. You can also look at things like passion fruit, which are evergreen and will keep their leaves all year round if you like. And then there are also annual plants, so we could look at things like trombotinos if you're prepared to keep them pruned back a bit. Yeah, there's a couple for starters.
Helen had a question about checking for phytophthora in soil. It's killing her persimmons, I think.
4 persimmons, gosh, Helen, sorry to hear that. I presume, are you planting them in the same spot, Helen? I'm not sure, but often it can be hard to establish a tree where one's been before. There is an effect that can inhibit the same plant from establishing in that location. As for checking for phytophthora, yeah, look, I mean, you can identify it with visual symptoms, but otherwise I think you have to send it to the lab to know that it's there, unfortunately. And yeah, I wouldn't say I'm an expert in doing that, Helen, so I'm not sure how much more I can add to that. Just maybe if you can't move position, maybe try a different crop in there. And maybe I'll swap you some persimmons from my tree, Helen. Get around that.
What do you use for your mulch, Kat?
Yeah, I use lots of things. I try not to buy mulch ever. So some things that I use are the spent vegetable plants from the previous season. I use them again on the veggie beds. That's also quite controversial, and you do get people saying you'll get worse and worse powdery mildew every year, for example, and I have not found that to be the case at all. So again, I just acknowledge that difference in opinion, but I use everything back on the surface of the bed afterwards. I do chop it up a little bit to help it have contact with the soil and break down. I will also use autumn leaves quite extensively, and where I live, within a short distance, we have lots of plane trees, and you can usually collect enough for a whole year's supply of mulch within an hour. And we stuff them into those olive barrels that we looked at in the beginning of the session, and we just have them on hand as a mulch supply all year round. So they are brilliant, fantastic, local, free, sustainable source of mulch. I've also used things like shredded cardboard and paper at a pinch. They're not very attractive though, so sometimes I'll put a cosmetic layer of something else over the top of them, like autumn leaves. Yes, and then actually I should mention the other thing is for any fruit trees, I do chop and drop, which is any prunings that come off the plant get chopped into small pieces about 15 centimetres and then dropped back on the surface. And finally, I use living mulches, like some of those ground covers that you saw underneath my fruit trees, the comfrey, the violet, the alpine strawberries. There are lots of great native examples as well if you've got drier soil, like myoporum, the bower spinach and warrigal greens, for example. So living mulches can be very effective as well.
Sylvia's asked a question. I think you mentioned this already, Kat, but the bottles of water that were in some of the pictures of your garden, and they're the ones with the little pinpricks that you're...
Oh, no, actually, no. I need to take them out of the photo because everybody asks about them all the time, or maybe not. So they're actually glass bottles with the base cut off, and we use them as mini greenhouses, or they're called cloches. And I use those around seedlings in early spring when it's quite cold, to help them get a little bit more warmth. Also protects them from quite a few pests as well that find it difficult to get into them. And yeah, so there's just a helpful little microclimate. If you don't have glass bottles, and also cutting them safely is an issue, so I do recommend plastic 2-litre clear juice bottles as a nice alternative for people at home, but certainly not essential. I find them particularly helpful with things like basil that I've already mentioned is a very warm soil plant and sometimes a bit hard to get established when the soil's still cold in Melbourne.
Sandra's asked this question a couple of times, so I do want to get to it. She uses scrim around tomatoes to stop possums eating them. Does that need to be removed during the day to let the light through, or?
I really don't know what scrim is.
No, I don't either.
I'm so sorry, Sandra. I have no idea what it is, but if you can clarify it and describe it a bit for me, maybe I use a different word for it, but pop that in the chat and we can come back.
Claire has asked about coffee granules, which I know we talked about lots in the soil session, which you can access on the My Smart Garden page. A quick answer on coffee?
Yeah, so coffee granules, this is another thing that people can quite easily get access to in Melbourne, the spent coffee grounds. They are acidic, and they can have an inhibitive effect on plant growth. So in small quantities, they're not a problem. And I know some people use them on the surface as a mulch around plants, and they tell me that they inhibit slugs and snails. Probably the best way, if there is a best way, is to put them through a compost system and allow them to be broken down a bit more, and then they're not going to impact on the plant growth as much, and they'll just become organic matter. That's fantastic. So that would probably be my suggestion, Claire. If you can compost them first, then just treat it like compost.
Wendy had a lovely question. She's got lots of garden space and chickens, but not the time and maybe capacity to manage. Where could you find someone to help with that kind of thing?
Yeah, well, there was a website, Landshare, I think, but it never really got the traction, which is such a shame because there's a real need for some kind of matching service for people like you, Wendy. So without having that, maybe there are ones that people can suggest. Probably I'd be looking at social media and networks like Rough Trade, of which there are many rough trade groups in local places around Melbourne. Also just trying through your networks, any local gardening groups, letting people know that you have that available and seeing if we can find someone locally.
I also thought of the Good Karma networks because they're often really thriving hubs for people. And yeah, I know particularly in Stonington, in some of our really built up areas, there's a lot of people in apartments without access to gardens. So if you're living in a dense area, Wendy, I reckon there'd be plenty of people keen to help you out.
Great suggestion, Beck. Yeah.
Colette's asked about planting tomatoes in the same plot every year.
Okay, yep, it's a nice long answer for you here. I'll just try and summarise it for you. I think the short answer is yes, Colette. Of course, there's good advice out there around rotating crops as much as possible. That's for two reasons. The first one is because some soil-borne pests and diseases can build up over time if you give them the right plant host in the same spot every year. The other reason is just because if you plant the same crop in the same place every year, it's drawing whatever mix of nutrients it requires. And so you start to draw the soil down more quickly than if you were rotating and having a more balanced draw of minerals from that space over time. Now, so I've been running gardening teaching things for about 10 years now. I've had one occasion where people have told me that they can't grow tomatoes anymore in the same space. And that was, I think, at the West Brunswick Food Forest. They have run into troubles and they need to stop growing tomatoes for a couple of years and allow that soil-borne disease to work its way out, and then they'd be able to put tomatoes in again. So I guess my advice is that I don't think it's as common as most people believe. And certainly if you've got a small space, I would encourage you to not worry and just instead focus on general soil health, keeping that organic matter up. Do check out that soil session that I mentioned for more tips, but just try and keep that soil in as good a health as you possibly can, and don't worry about it until it becomes a problem if you don't have any other option to rotate.
Thanks, Kat. Someone's asked about, is it true citrus trees shouldn't be planted near other plants for competition of nutrients? Yeah, she has lemon, mandarin and orange trees that are struggling.
Badly, yeah. Citrus are, they're actually quite difficult trees to establish, and I acknowledge it just wasn't time to talk about that in this session, but they do grow really well in pots and in hot spaces, so it's worth mentioning them. Yeah, so they're quite fragile. They need a perfect mix of nutrients, a nice balance level throughout the year. They also need perfect moisture. They don't love competition, especially from other really strong, vigorous trees like eucalyptus trees, as a classic example. So yeah, like I've got, you would have seen the persimmon right next door to the citrus at the mandarin, and I've got comfrey and I've got lots of ground covers growing right underneath it. So it's not always an issue, but if you've got really large established trees and particularly quite competitive, strong, hungry ones, especially eucalypts, then a citrus usually will struggle getting established next to them. So there's a bit of nuance in there, but yeah, I'd say it's broadly true, Daphne.
Sandra's clarified that her the scrim is made up of day curtains, which are usually made of scrim. So I think that would be pretty thick and light wouldn't penetrate through.
Okay, so we're talking about like you've improvised some kind of netting from old curtains, which is fabulous, but you're noticing that it's casting quite a shadow. And I've had that experience as well from upcycling curtains as nets. And I found that it wasn't so much an issue in summer, and in fact it might have been helpful, just a little bit of extra shade. But in winter, it noticeably slowed down the growth, and I had to remove it if I wanted the plants to get enough light. And so, of course, you could replace it at night, as you say, if possums are the issue. But yes, I'm agreeing.
We have a few people talking about possums, and I have just shared that we did cover possums in the pests webinar we ran a couple of months ago, Kat, so I've linked that there. I know you've had a bit of success with it. Is it the ping string?
Yeah, that's right. And so it's certainly not the only way of managing possums. There's a range of solutions. At my place, they've been epic. I've never come across such like possums rampaging through, eating everything as I have in this particular property. And our solution, after trying lots of things, including netting, which they ripped open, is something called a ping string, PINGG, which is a low voltage, very small domestic scale electric wire that you can run around fence lines. And that has been so far 100% effective at keeping possums out, and also mostly effective at keeping my cat inside, which also solves some of the challenges with rodents that you can get in urban areas. So yeah, my cat has actually learned how to jump it in certain circumstances. So we're playing a game of cat and mouse with my cat where we have to block off a few places that he can leap over, but the possums have not worked out how to do that yet. So do check that out if you are committing to a space, and it might be worth that investment for you.
Thanks, Kat. Janice has asked a question about compost and it getting mouldy. For example, if you throw coffee into the compost bin, it usually turns mouldy. And can you prevent that? And is that an issue?
And it's not an issue for the compost process itself, but of course, if there's any concern about mold spores and your health, then yeah, that's something to think about. Yeah, mold is a natural part of those things breaking down. So to some extent, it's just going to happen. I guess making sure that the coffee is not in big clumps and it's distributed through the rest of the ingredients in there can help other types of microorganism to balance them out and make it less likely that it will go moldy. But I don't know of any way to totally prevent that, I'm afraid.
Lucy's asked just about these webinars. So the City of Stonington has 4 webinars that we run with Kat on our website. That's Gardening 101, kind of getting started, soil health, propagation and pests. They were the 4 we ran, and they'll be on our website for a long time. And there's also a whole bunch on My Smart Garden, heaps and heaps of webinars that we've run all year. And they're kind of available indefinitely, maybe about a year actually. They're not going to stay up forever. But yeah, you'll definitely have time to watch them, and that's a growing collection. This one will be added there as well.
And lots of other presenters as well. And I think it's great to get diversity of experience and perspective. So check them out. Hey, Beck, I just want to go back because I think we missed a question from Lucy and also one from Deborah. So Lucy asked a while ago about your thoughts on rock minerals. And Lucy, I think they were discussed in that soil session as well. But just briefly, rock minerals, I think are probably helpful if you live in an area where you don't have a lot of rock minerals already in your soil. So places that have got very sandy soils along the eastern suburbs of Melbourne are one example. Over where I live, we have a lot of volcanic soil, which it is rock mineral basically. So I'm not necessarily sure there's much point adding extra. It's one of those products where, you know, it develops a reputation probably beyond what it can actually do. So yeah, I guess I'd use it in some contexts if I had concerns that there weren't enough minerals, and I would be looking at the plants as indicators of whether they were growing healthily or not. I certainly don't throw it on the garden when it's already growing beautifully. There's no point doing that, in my opinion. And Deborah asked, do you recommend adding stones or similar at the bottom of pots? And it's an interesting one, Deborah, because it's one of those things you read everywhere. But my advice, or my understanding, is that it's actually not helping with drainage. It's actually a bit of a myth. And I certainly don't use it, and I never have problems with drainage out of my pots. It's something to do with water not liking to move through different mediums. So it actually creates a bit of a barrier rather than helping that water to drain through. So it's an interesting one. Again, I'm diverging from a lot of advice that's out there, but all I can say is I don't do it, and I haven't needed to.
I think we've got through most of the questions, Kat, and I reckon at 12:20 we might leave it there. So thanks again for everything this morning, and thanks for hanging around for us and answering those extra few questions. We hope you all have an amazing Saturday and weekend, everyone. And yeah, hope to see you at my Smart Garden event soon.